Okay, Padawans, I'm going to talk to you today about evolution. First and foremost, this is not up for debate. Evolution is real. They call it a theory because it's based on many different hypotheses, but it is fact. All right, you will go into the exam if you believe that humans did not evolve from apes. You will be at a disadvantage when you go into that exam. Now, if you need help with this, there is a person by the name of Francis Collins. You can look him up. He is a devout Catholic. He runs the Human Genome Research Institute, HGRI. Actually, I believe he runs NIH now. When I met him, he ran the Human Genome Research Institute. Now he runs NIH. He's a devout Catholic, and he believes in evolution, and he talks about this on YouTube. So you can probably find him on YouTube somewhere. All right? So the three questions I asked you was one, the first question was give three evidence. The second question I asked you was to justify the evidence. The third question was to explain natural selection. Okay, and the fourth one was to give, again, three examples of natural selection. So I'm not going to give you the full answer, but I'm going to go through some bits and pieces. All right, so for the first one, for the evidence. Okay, so the evidence of evolution. All right, there are several things you can pick from. First and foremost, for evidence, okay? Do not just say anatomy, and do not just say biogeography without explaining these terms. Anatomy just means anatomy, like you have an arm and a leg and you have 5 fingers and 5 toes. Anatomy by itself does not equal evolution. Okay? Biogeography, I have a problem with this term without you trying to explain it, because by itself, it doesn't mean anything. The word by itself does not equate to evolution. Now, better terms to use, like for biogeography, instead of using biogeography, just simply say homologous structures. So homologous structures, I'll give you three things. There's homologous structures, there is analogous structures, okay? I can't spell right now. So we have homologous and analogous, okay? Homologous means, what this means is these have the same ancestor, okay? An example of homologous structures is the pentadactyl limb, okay? This is an example of homologous structures. For example, so the wing of a bat, the arm of a dog or a cat, the fin of a dolphin, they all have the exact same structure. So your arm has one bone, then it has two bones, then it has many bones, right? This is your shoulder, this is your body, right? This is your head, right? So your first bone is, you have one bone, then you have two bones in your forearm, then you have your wrist, okay? All pentadactyl limbs follow this structure. They have one bone, they have two bones, they have many bones, okay? Now, this is true for dolphins that swim. This is true for bats that fly. This is true for dogs and cats that walk or run. And for the life of me, I'm missing something else. But that's an example of they all have the same ancestor, but they have different functions. One flies, one swims, one climbs and grabs things. Okay? Analogous structures, these have a different ancestor. Okay? Now this would not be used for evidence, because this actually is this will answer number 2 as to justify it. Because homologous structures shows evidence of evolution. Analogous structures do not. For example, a wing of a fly versus a wing of a bat. Now, you're going to have to Google these images because I can't draw them off the fly. But if you Google the image of a fly wing or a bat wing, they're very, very different. But they both have the same function. Okay? So, homologous structures. Now, some of you asked me this question too. Homologous structures, this would be an example of convergent evolution. I'm sorry, divergent. Because you have one ancestor and you have different functions and they evolve different pathways. Okay? Analogous structures have different ancestors, but they have the same function. So that would be convergent evolution because they come together. Converge means come together. All right? So I'm getting a little off track, but our evidence for evolution. Let me take a step backwards because I'm getting a little sidetracked. Okay, so we have. Okay, so I'm gonna erase this all real fast. Okay. So for evidence. Okay, things you can say are fossil record, or if you say embryology or biogeography or anatomy, these words by themselves do not mean evolution. You need to explain what they are. So embryology, if you look at the embryos of everything, an embryo of a fly, an embryo of a bird, embryo of any species look exactly the same as everything else. You can't tell the difference until the embryo gets closer to being born. A snake, in the beginning, looks exactly like a dog or a cat or a human. So you need to explain embryology if you're going to pick that one. Biogeography. This is real simple. You have, okay, this is a really bad picture. Okay, all right, we have North America and we have South America, right? Over here, we have Africa, we have Europe, we have Asia, okay? You have a mouse here. Here's my mouse, okay? I have a mouse here. I have a mouse over here. Every single continent has mice. Every single continent has cats. Every single continent has birds. So this is biogeography, is that we have similar features. So don't just say biogeography. What you want to say is you want to say there's a pattern. There's a pattern of biogeography. That's what you want to say. Because every continent has similar organisms. Why is Australia, Australia has its own, Australia has a lot of species that do not exist anywhere else because Australia broke off from Pangea a long time ago, and you have things on there that are nowhere else. Same for Madagascar, which is off Australia, right? So, it's not just, you can't just say biogeography. You have to explain what that is. Anatomy, you have to explain anatomy. You can't just say anatomy is evidence for evolution. Okay, so anatomy, you want to use homology. You use that word, okay? Now I mentioned vestigial structures. Vestigial structures, you can Google these. There's a lot of examples of vestigial structures. So you can go on and you can Google this, but it's like your tailbone. your tailbone is an example of a vestigial structure. That's evidence that you had a tail at one point, but that tail was never used, and so it became, over time, it became smaller and smaller and smaller. Okay? So you have dolphins and fish dolphins and whales, they don't have ears, but I believe they have an ear bone. Again, because they were mammals and they evolved to live in the ocean, and they still have that ear bone. So I believe that's an example of one too. But Google vestigial, Vestigial. That's an example of the evolution. So for number one, to get 7 marks, you need to give 3 examples. Okay, and then so if you name them, that's 3 points. Okay, the other 4 points, you need to describe them. You need to give me details about each one of these. Okay, now, that goes back, now number 2. Okay, so, number 2, justify. Now, I'm only going to use one example for this. So, let's just use fossil record. Okay, so for justify, the fossil record has gaps. It is not perfect. Now here you can go Google online examples of, there's websites dedicated to disproving evolution by crazy religious people who don't want to accept that we came from chimpanzees. Right? So you can, but the fossil record, okay, look, we only have fossils of like less than 1%. Less than 1% of anything becomes a fossil. So the fossil record, you might have, okay, look, let's say we have like a square, and then it's a bigger square, and then you have like a circle. You might be missing this thing right here in the middle, right? This is what we call transitional fossils. Okay, transitional fossils show these steps. So if you're going from like a fish and you're going into a bird, there's my bird, or whatever, my flying thing, whatever it is, right? Where's those intermediate steps? So, justify means give the pros and cons of the fossil record. Okay? How does it show evolution? And what are the problems with the fossil record? The fossil record shows these steps along the way. Right? It shows how fish evolved into reptiles and chimpanzees and so on. But there's missing links. This is often what people use to say that this is how people justify we did not evolve from chimpanzees. Okay? So justify means to take your evidence of evolution and justify them to the theory of evolution. Like what makes them prove the theory of evolution and what doesn't. Okay? So that's number 2. Okay, number 3. Explain natural selection. Okay, a lot of you kind of went off on... okay, things do not adapt. Okay, a dog does not consciously go, hey, you know what, I'm going to build a machine and adapt to live in the cold weather like a human does. Right? Humans can consciously adapt. We choose to live in space. We choose to live in Antarctica. We choose to change. We can change our food. Right? You don't eat chicken one day, you want to eat beef the next day. We can choose to eat mushrooms. We have brains. We can consciously choose how to adapt. Okay? Animals and plants don't consciously adapt. Animals and plants do not adapt. So, Google for me, there's 4 conditions for natural selection to occur. Okay? First, natural selection is a mechanism. Okay? So, natural selection is a mechanism for evolution. Okay? Animals don't adapt. There has to be variation. So, if you have a mouse, here's my mouse, and my other mouse, and my other mouse, and maybe this one is black, and this one is white, and this one is striped. Okay? They're all mice, they all interbreed, and they have different variations. Variation has to exist in the population for natural selection to occur. Okay? Now, Now, another condition for natural selection is competition. So one, these traits have to be heritable. Now, a lot of you described Lamarckian. So little sidebar here. Lamarck got it wrong. Okay? A lot of you, some of you use the example of a giraffe. Okay? Animals that use an adaptation does not mean they evolve. A giraffe stretching its neck does not evolve. Does not consciously evolve or adapt, right? So there's variation in the population, okay? And some of those individuals are more successful. So here's my population of mice. They have different variation. Some of these guys, 1, 2, or 3, one of these guys will be more successful. The more successful mouse is going to breed and reproduce, and you will see a change in heritable traits, right? So the number of individuals with the black coat versus the number of individuals that have the white coat and number of individuals that have the striped coat is going to change over time, okay? So the two key ideas is variation and competition. So one, animals or plants have to produce more offspring than the environment can support. If the environment only supports 500 individuals and you're breeding at 2,000 individuals every year, then like if you're a tree and you spread 2,000 seeds, but the environment can only support 500, that means only the ones that have the best adaptations will survive, reproduce, pass on their offspring. They'll outcompete the others. That's natural selection. Okay? So things don't just adapt to the environment. The adaptations are there, they're present in the population, and then changes in the environment is what cause selective pressure. So an important key word there is selective pressure. Right? If there's no selective pressure, you don't have if there's no selective pressure, you can't have natural selection and you can't get evolution. Without natural selection, you don't have a path towards evolution. Oh, another example of evidence can be artificial selection. So artificial selection, and so you cannot use these. Artificial selection means that we did it. Humans chose it. Anything that's domesticated is artificial selection or selective breeding. Okay? These are not examples of natural selection. They're evidence for evolution. Dogs, cats, domesticated cats, horses. Horses have been bred for thousands of years. Dogs have been bred for thousands of years. There's, I believe, if you take a wolf with his fangs, I believe if you breed a wolf 70 times, you can breed out and become a dog within 70 generations. Maybe it's less than that. But we've bred these animals over the years, and this is evidence for evolution, not natural selection. It's not natural. Natural happens in the environment. You cannot apply the rules of natural selection to humans because we have the ability to change our scenario. We can change our food. We can change our situation. We can go live somewhere else. We can move. We can build technology. So the rules of ecology do not apply to humans. Okay? So in all of these examples, do not use humans as your examples ever. Unless you're using, like, if you want to talk about vestigial structures or talk about pentadactyl limbs, if you want to use, like, pentadactyl limbs or vestigial structures, you can talk about humans and evidence. But don't use them as examples of natural selection or examples of evolution. I mean, if you want to use chimpanzees to humans as an example of evolution, that's fine. But I would stick to plants and animals outside the human race. Okay, now that is natural selection. So the last question that we have here is examples of natural selection. So I will give you have to treat this like a little story. Okay? So natural selection. So acceptable examples of acceptable examples might be Now, gets wordy. Okay, so it is the development of bacterial. Sorry, how did I word this? Yeah, bacterial resistance due to the overuse of antibiotics. Okay? We use antibiotics so much that they have adapted by chance to survive our antibiotics. Penicillin is basically almost useless now because everything has resistance towards penicillin, which is the first antibiotic. Okay, but it didn't just come out of nowhere. You can't just say, oh, bacterial resistance is an example of natural selection. No, it's the development of bacterial resistance due to the overuse of antibiotics. Okay, the peppered moth. The peppered moth by itself is not an example. The peppered moth changed due to the changes in population of the peppered moth due to the Industrial Revolution. Now, I had you guys do a little activity on this, right? So the peppered moth, it adapted, it changed, right? The dark one was more successful during the Industrial Revolution when the smog coated the trees and turned the trees from white to dark. And that variation was more successful. And then it changed back. That's an example of natural selection. You got to give a little story. You can also use predator-prey. So predator and prey. So, for example, you have the fox and the bunny, right? The bunnies will increase, and then the fox increase, and then the bunnies die off, and then the fox dies off, and then the bunnies increase again, right? So there's your bunnies, and then there's your fox. That's also an example of natural selection. So when you're giving examples of natural selection, you have to give a little story. You have to give some background information, like what is the change in the environment that created the pressure that induced the change. Okay, so for bacterial resistance, bacteria were never exposed to penicillin or ampicillin or other antibiotics. But the more we expose them to them, the more they spread. Now, the ones that survive continue to breed, and they passed on their genes again. So, right, we need to have for natural selection to occur, right? The traits must be heritable. Oh, I think I mentioned Lamarck. Okay. So, what Lamarck basically said that if you use or disuse something, it leads to changes. So a giraffe that stretches his neck. There's also if you Google Lamarck, you see a picture of a crab. Here's my crab, and it has one really big claw and one really small claw. Now he hypothesized that the crab used the right claw more than the left claw, and that one passed on his genes. That's not how it works. We know that's not how it works, right? We know that mutations are random. We know that random mutations cause changes in protein structure, and protein structure causes changes in your phenotype, which is how you look and how long your claws are, how big your teeth are, how fast you run, right? So mutations are random. Sexual reproduction mixes up those traits every time, so that's why your kid is never the same as the parent. They're slightly different, right? That creates variation, right? And then there's selective pressure induced by the environment. If there's no drought, because the environment changes, there's a drought, there's a heavy rainstorm, there's an earthquake. Because there's things in the environment that cause pressure, There has to be a fight for survival. If there's no fight for survival, if things don't fight to survive, they're not going to evolve, right? There's no pressure to evolve. There must be pressure, which means there must be things competing for food, shelter, water. Without that competition, there's no natural selection, there's no evolution. So be careful not to describe Lamarck. Okay, if you describe Lamarckian examples, you're gonna get that wrong, because Lamarck got it wrong. Lamarck came before Darwin. Okay, so be careful not to use his examples. And that's really it. So, woo, that was 25 minutes. So there is my four different There's the 4 questions I asked you from 5.1, 5.2. Evidence for evolution, justify the evidence, explain natural selection, and give examples. Okay? If you have questions, please watch the video multiple times. You can pause it, rewind it. I cover a lot of different ideas. Okay? The most important thing is, there's a couple things that I want you to hit on again. Don't say things adapt, right? Because it's not, animals and plants don't consciously adapt to the environment. It's not intentional. There's a lot of this is why I think it's hard for people to accept evolution as fact, because they it can't be random. There must be a God who dictates it. Maybe that's true, maybe it's not. But natural selection is random, right? Variation is random. And then you have pressure in the environment to compete for food and water. The individuals that have the best adaptations survive, reproduce, pass on their offspring, and that offspring will go on and their traits have to be passed on genetically. And there's a debate on what that means, right? Because is behavior genetic? We don't always know that. Right? Some things we do, we only know 5 or 10% of what your genes do. So there's a lot of genes out there. The debate will go on forever about how much is nature versus nurture. What's dictated by your genes and what's not. And there's lots of examples of natural selection. So please use the web. Please use my website. Please use just simply Google what is the evidence for evolution, and Google the websites that say it's not real, and read their arguments. And I guarantee if you read the arguments on both sides, you're always gonna, if you're following logic, you're gonna side with evolution because the evidence for it is overwhelming. And if you don't, then you're gonna go into that exam at disadvantage, because this is accepted scientific context, right? The evolution is real. It's occurring every time. It's slow. It changes over time, and that's it. So make sure you can give me evidence and justify the evidence. Okay, what is the especially fossils? What is the evidence for fossils? How are fossils evidence for evolution, and how are they not evidence for evolution? And you can do the same thing with homologous structures, vestigial structures. Okay, all right. And I think that's really, I'm almost at 30 minutes now. I'm not going to try to refilm this, so hopefully it makes sense. Hopefully I was clear the whole way through. Please message me questions if you don't understand. And thank you.